the woman in uniform. The early morning air was cool. The city streets were just beginning to wake. Shops were opening, traffic was building, and the first rays of sunlight were cutting through the gray sky. Among the crowd moving toward the bus stop was a woman in a dark blue security guard uniform. Her steps were steady, her posture straight, and her face calm. But her eyes carried a quiet weight. In her right hand, she held a plain black bag, and in her left, a slightly worn violin case. Most people didn't notice the case at first. What they noticed was the uniform, for many. That was enough to decide who she was and what her life must be like. She stepped onto the bus, and the familiar routine began. A businessman looked her up and down, then returned to scrolling on his phone. A young couple whispered something and smiled to each other. A teenager glanced at her badge and quickly looked away. None of them said anything out loud, but she could feel their thoughts. It wasn't the first time. It happened every day, too. Them, she was just a security guard, a job they imagined belonged to someone who had run out of other options. Someone ordinary, someone forgettable. She moved down the aisle, finding an empty seat near the middle of the bus. Her violin case rested against her leg, but no one gave it a second look if they had. They might have wondered why a security guard carried a violin at all. The truth was, she carried it everywhere, not because she needed it for her job, but because she needed it for herself. That violin was her escape, her secret, and her strength. It had been with her through the quietest nights on duty and the longest bus rides home. It had been her comfort when the world seemed to see only her uniform and nothing else. Of small shops, fruit sellers arranging their stalls, children walking to school, the hum of the engine mixed with the chatter of passengers. Someone at the back was laughing loudly. Two women near the front were talking about an upcoming music event in the city. Her ears caught every detail of their conversation. She had heard about that event before, a cultural night where musicians from around the city would perform. She wondered what it would be like to play there. She had imagined it many times. Standing under warm stage lights, bow in hand, the first note filling the air. But those were just daydreams. Dreams she kept folded away like a piece of paper in her pocket. They were too fragile to expose to the world. The bus stopped to pick up more passengers. A man in a suit stepped in, holding a cup of coffee. He glanced around, saw the empty seat next to her, and hesitated. Then he chose to stand instead. She wasn't offended. She was used to it. But deep inside, a quiet ache stirred. People had a way of deciding who you were before you ever spoke. They judged by what they saw. And what they saw was a uniform. They didn't see the late nights she spent practicing in her small rented room. They didn't see the calluses on her fingers from hours of playing. They didn't see the way music kept her alive in a world that often felt cold. She kept her gaze on the window. Outside, the city was fully awake now, the streets alive with movement. A street musician played the guitar near a corner, his case open for coins. She watched him for a moment as the bus passed, feeling a connection to someone who lived for music in a world that didn't always listen. Her hand tightened slightly on the handle of her violin case. She wanted to play right, there on the bus. To fill the air with sounds so beautiful, it would cut through every assumption. But she stayed silent. There was a time and place for everything, and this was not it. The bus ride continued. Every stop bringing new faces. Some passengers glanced at her, then looked away. Others didn't notice her at all, but she noticed everything. She noticed the tired eyes of the man sitting across from her, the way the young woman beside him kept checking her phone, the way the driver tapped his fingers on the steering wheel in rhythm to a song only he could hear. She had learned to read people without words. Perhaps that was why she understood that the ones who judged her the most were often the ones carrying their own hidden weights. When the bus finally reached the stop near her workplace, she stood and made her way toward the door. The violin case swung slightly at her side. She stepped off the bus and into the noise of the street. Ahead was the tall glass building she guarded every day. To most, it was just her workplace, but to her, it was also a place where her mind wandered to melodies while her body stood watch. As she walked toward the building, she knew something inside her was shifting. She didn't know exactly when or how, But she felt it there would come a day when the people who only saw her uniform would hear her music. And on that day, their silence would be different. Whispers and assumptions. The next morning began like any other. The city was half awake, its streets still holding on to the quiet before the rush. She walked the same path to the bus stop, her uniform neat, her violin case in hand. Two strangers. She looked exactly the same as yesterday, but inside, she carried the faint echo of a melody she had played alone the night before. It was still fresh in her mind, notes rising and falling like soft waves. She hummed it under her breath as she waited for the bus, her eyes on the thin fog curling above the pavement. When the bus arrived, the door hissed open, and she stepped inside. Immediately, she felt it, the shift in air, the subtle turn of heads. A pair of students near the front glanced at her, one leaning to whisper something to the other. They both smiled in that way people do when they think their words are safe from the person they're about. She had no idea what they were saying, but she didn't need to. She'd seen enough lips curve that way to understand. As she moved down the aisle, a middle-aged woman in a bright coat gave her a quick look, then turned to the man beside her and murmured something. His eyes flicked toward the uniform and then away. She knew those glances. They were the quiet, passing judgments that left no trace on the outside but built up like stones on the inside. Some thought a uniform meant she was invisible. Others thought it meant she was beneath them. Either way, she had learned to carry herself like their opinions didn't matter. But the truth was, some days they did. She took her seat by the window. Letting the violin case rest against her knees, the bus jerked forward. She watched the city slip past. A few rows ahead, the same businessman from yesterday was scrolling on his phone. His reflection caught in the glass. He didn't look back at her, but she remembered the way he'd avoided sitting next to her. That tiny choice, so small it could almost be excused, had still stayed with her overnight. People didn't realize how much a small act could speak. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden burst of laughter from the back. Two young men were talking loudly about the weekend. One of them spotted her violin case and said something she didn't catch. The other laughed harder, shaking his head. She didn't know if the joke was about her or something else, but her grip on the case tightened. There was always that question in her mind. Were they laughing at her or just near her? When you were judged often enough, you stopped trusting coincidence. She shifted her attention to the streets outside. Street poster caught her eye. A bright splash of red and gold announcing the city's annual cultural night it promised. Live music, food stalls, and performances from artists all across the region. She read the date, her heart skipping a beat. It was only 2 weeks away. She had heard of it before, even imagined herself playing there, but the thought had always felt like fiction. She smiled faintly at the idea, then quickly looked away. Daydreams were one thing, reality was another. And reality was that she was riding a crowded bus. Wearing a uniform that seemed to speak louder than her own voice, the bus made another stop, letting in a wave of passengers. An elderly man shuffled down the aisle and took the seat beside her without hesitation. He nodded politely and glanced at the violin case. "Play?" he asked simply, his voice kind. She nodded, and he smiled before settling back into his seat. It was rare for anyone to acknowledge the case at all. That small moment, brief as it was, felt like a warm light in the cold. Still, the whispers continued. Around her, she didn't catch every word, but she caught the tones: pity, amusement, dismissal. The same assumptions followed her like shadows. She imagined what these people would think if they saw her under stage lights, bow in hand, playing a piece so beautiful that it hushed the loudest room. She imagined their expressions shifting, their thoughts scrambling to rewrite the story they had already told themselves about her. That thought didn't come from pride. It came from the longing to be seen. Not just looked at, but truly seen. The bus neared her stop, and she stood, adjusting the strap of her bag. The violin case bumped gently against her side as she made her way to the door. She stepped off into the noise of the street, feeling the weight of the morning still clinging to her. The building where she worked was just ahead, tall and sharp against the sky. She walked toward it. But the poster she'd seen on the bus kept flashing in her mind. Cultural night, 2 weeks away. She didn't know why. But this time the thought didn't fade as quickly as it usually did. it stayed, steady and stubborn, like a seed waiting for the right moment to grow as she reached the building entrance. She glanced down at her violin case. Her reflection in the glass doors showed a woman in uniform. But behind that, she knew there was more. And maybe, just maybe, the world was about to find out. The invitation, the week passed in its usual rhythm, long hours on duty, quiet evenings at home, and the steady routine of bus rides between. The two but one evening, as the sun was dipping low and painting the streets in orange light, something different happened. She had finished her shift and decided to take a longer route home. It was one of those small, unplanned choices, the kind where you don't think much about it, you just feel like walking a little farther before catching the bus. Her path took her through a small public park, the kind that was mostly empty after sunset, except for a few people out for fresh air. The air was cool, the grass smelled damp, and the street lamps were just beginning to flicker on. She sat on a wooden bench near the far end of the park, away from the main path, setting her bag down. She opened her violin case with practiced care. The familiar scent of varnished wood rose up, calming her. She lifted the violin and rested it under her chin. For a moment, she just closed her eyes and breathed. Then, slowly, she began to play. The first notes were soft, like a whisper between. The trees, her bow moved with gentle precision. Drawing out a melody she had been shaping for months, it was a song without words. But it told stories of long bus rides where she felt invisible, of quiet nights spent watching the city lights from a lonely window, of dreams she kept alive even when no one believed in them. Somewhere behind her, footsteps slowed. She didn't notice right away, too caught up in the music. But when the last note of her piece faded, a voice spoke from the shadows that, the voice said warmly, is the sound of someone who's been hiding for too long. She turned, startled. An older man stood a few steps away, leaning on a cane. His coat buttoned against the evening chill. He had kind eyes and a small smile. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to intrude, but I heard you from the path, and I couldn't just keep walking." She lowered the violin slightly, unsure what to say. The man stepped closer. "I taught music for 30 years, he explained. "And I can tell when someone plays from the heart." He paused, looking at her uniform, then at the violin. "Do you perform anywhere?" he asked. She shook her head, almost embarrassed. "Just here," she said softly, "or at home, when I have the time." The man's smile widened. "That's a shame," he said, "because there's a place where people need to hear you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is an invitation," he said, handing it to her. 2 weeks from now. "The city's cultural night. I'm one of the organizers, and I'd like you to perform." Her fingers hesitated before taking the paper. I'm not a professional," she said, her voice unsure. "You're a musician," he replied simply. "And that's enough." She looked down at the invitation, thick paper, embossed letters, and her name written neatly in pen. It didn't feel real. Her first thought was of all the people who might laugh if they saw her on stage. Her second thought was of the bus rides, the whispers, the smirks, and then, slowly, another thought pushed through. What if this was the moment she had been waiting for without even knowing it? Still, doubts clung to her. "I can't afford to buy a dress for a performance," she said. "I don't even know the rules for something like this." The man chuckled. "Wear whatever you like. Let the music be the only thing people notice." That night, she walked home with the invitation folded in her pocket. The weight of it felt strange, as if it was heavier than paper, when she reached her small room. She set her violin case on the table and stared at the invitation for a long time. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to let it slip away so she wouldn't have to face the fear of being judged. But another part, the part that had carried her through years of quiet practice, told her this was her chance. The next day, during her bus ride to work, she pulled the invitation from her bag and read it again. The students were still whispering. The businessman still scrolling. Nothing about the world had changed, but she realized something inside her was starting too. She imagined walking onto a stage not as the woman in the uniform, but as someone they had never truly seen before. She imagined the first note rising into the air. She imagined the silence in the room as the music took Over. By the time the bus reached her stop, she had made her decision. She would play. Not to prove them wrong, but to remind herself who she really was. The day of the performance, the day came faster than she expected.
Oh.
2 weeks had slipped by in a blur of work shifts, bus rides, and stolen hours at night where she practiced, until her arms ached. Every free moment was spent with the violin, not just playing songs she already knew, but fine-tuning every note of the piece she wanted to perform. It wasn't a famous composition. It was her own, a melody she had carried in her heart for years, shaped by lonely nights, city lights, and the quiet resilience she never spoke about. That morning she woke before sunrise. Her small room was still dark. The only sound, the distant hum of traffic starting to stir. She sat on the edge of her bed, her violin case by her side. She thought about what the old man had told her. Let the music be the only thing people notice. She could have borrowed a dress or tried to blend in with the other performers, but she chose otherwise. She would wear her uniform. Not as a disguise, but as a statement. The same uniform people had judged her for would be the one she stood in when the music began. By mid-morning, the city was alive. The cultural center stood at the heart of downtown, its glass doors reflecting the bright sky. She arrived early, the violin case in one hand, her bag slung over her shoulder and side. The air buzzed with activity, performers tuning instruments, technicians adjusting, lights, organizers checking schedules. She slipped quietly to the backstage area. Some people glanced at her uniform and immediately assumed she was part of the security staff. One of the volunteers even tried to direct her to the side entrance where the guards were stationed. She smiled politely and said nothing instead. She found a quiet corner and sat down with her violin. She closed her eyes and let her fingers run over the strings. Feeling the familiar vibrations in that small corner, the noise of the room faded. Replaced by the soft hum of her own preparation, the event began in the afternoon. From backstage, she could hear the muffled applause as the first few acts performed. A dance troupe, a choir, a pianist whose playing rippled like water. The air was thick with both excitement and nerves. Every now and then, someone would pass her by with a curious glance, wondering why a woman in a security uniform was sitting with a violin. She didn't explain. The less they knew now, the more powerful the moment would be later. As the hours passed, the tension in her chest grew. She thought of the people who would be in the audience, strangers, dignitaries, artists, and possibly some of the very passengers from her daily bus rides. The thought sent a shiver through her. What if they laughed? What if they whispered the same way they always did? She tightened her grip on the bow, reminding herself that tonight wasn't about them. It was about the music. It was about finally stepping out of the shadow she had been living in. When the sun began to set, casting warm light through the tall windows of the cultural center, her name was called, or rather her name followed by the simple words, A. Surprise performer. There was no introduction, no description of who she was. She stepped out from behind the curtain, her boots firm on the polished wooden floor. The stage lights hit her face. Bright and almost blinding, she could feel dozens of eyes on her. A ripple of confusion moved through the audience. She saw a few eyebrows raise.
Ow!
A couple of whispered questions. A man in the front row leaned toward the woman next to him and murmured something while glancing at her uniform. She didn't flinch. She simply walked to the center of the stage. Her violin case rested on a stool beside her. She opened it slowly, the faint click of the latch echoing in the quiet room. The audience was still unsure. This wasn't the elegant performer they were expecting. But the moment she lifted the violin to her chin, the uncertainty began to fade. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on a point just above the crowd. The bow touched the strings, and the first note floated into the air. It was soft at first, like the whisper of wind through an empty street. Then it grew, gathering warmth and depth. Her fingers danced with precision, each note blending into the next. The melody was her story, unspoken but felt. It carried the weight of every judgment she had endured, the quiet strength of every long shift, and the hidden fire of a dream that had never died. As she played, the room changed. The whispers stopped. Heads leaned forward. The businessman she recognized from the bus was frozen in his seat. his phone forgotten in his lap. Every note seemed to strip away the image they had formed of her, revealing something far richer. By the time the final note hung in the air, the silence was absolute. Then, slowly at first, the applause began. Hesitant claps growing into a thunderous ovation. She lowered her bow, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely seen. She gave a small nod, not as a bow of gratitude, but as a quiet acknowledgement the music had spoken, and they had heard. The reveal for a heartbeat after the final note faded, there was only stillness. The applause had started slowly, but now it filled the hall like a wave. She stood there in her uniform, violin still in hand, bow lowered at her side. The lights warmed her face, but it was the energy from the crowd that truly reached her. They weren't clapping out of politeness. They were clapping because the music had left something inside them they couldn't ignore. Some people in the front row leaned forward, eyes narrowed, as if trying to connect the image before them with the sound they had just heard. Others glanced at one another, their expressions almost asking the same silent question, who is she? She noticed the businessman from the bus in the third row, his posture straight, his face unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, and he looked away quickly. The host walked back onto the stage, microphone in hand, a bright smile on his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight, you have witnessed something truly special." He turned to her. "This is not a performer from any professional roster, not a name you've seen on posters," he said. "She is someone who came here in her own way, carrying her music straight from her life to this stage." There was a murmur through the audience. Some were shocked, others curious. The host gestured toward her violin. "Would you like to say something?" he asked. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the neck of the violin. She had not planned to speak, she had only planned to play, but the faces in front of her, many of them still carrying the remnants of their first impressions, pulled the words out of her. "I wear this uniform every day," she began softly, her voice steady but quiet. "And most days, that's all people see." A few heads lowered. She didn't say it with anger. "Only as truth. They don't see the hours I spend here." She tapped the violin lightly. "The nights I practice alone. The music that's been my world since I was a child." She glanced across the crowd. "Tonight, I didn't change who I am to be here. I didn't hide the uniform piece, because I wanted the music to be the only thing you heard before you decided who I was." The hall was silent. Even the faint sound of someone shifting in their seat seemed loud. Her words hung in the air, and she could see the shift. Some people were uncomfortable, some inspired, others simply listened, knowing they had been part of what she was talking about. She nodded once to the host, stepped back, and left the stage. The applause followed her. It wasn't the same kind of noise she had heard at the beginning this time. It had weight. It was not just clapping for a performance, but for the person behind it. Backstage, several other performers came to her. A woman from the choir touched her arm and said, "That was honest, beautiful." A young guitarist grinned and said, "You stole the night." The old man with the cane, the one who had given her the invitation, was waiting near the side curtain. He didn't say much, just a simple, "I knew you'd do this," followed by a proud smile when the event ended. She slipped out quietly outside. The night air felt different, lighter, freer. A few audience members recognized her near the entrance and stopped her to shake her hand. One woman said, "I'll never look at a uniform the same way again." That meant more to her than any compliment about her playing. She began her walk to the bus stop. The city streets were alive with the glow of street lamps and the hum of late-night traffic. She held her violin case close. She didn't feel taller. Or more important, she just felt like herself. Without needing to hide it, when the bus arrived, she stepped on, this time. The atmosphere was different. People glanced at her, but the looks weren't the same as before. She spotted a man she recognized from her morning rides. He gave a small nod and a smile. The businessman was there too, sitting near the middle. When he saw her, he hesitated, then gestured to the empty seat beside him. She took it quietly. They didn't speak, but she noticed the faint respect in his eyes. The bus rolled forward. Carrying her back toward her small room, the whispers were gone tonight. No sideways glances, no smirks. It wasn't because the uniform had changed. It was because they had. And deep down, she knew this wasn't the last time she would play. Not for them, not for a crowd, but for herself. In every place where someone believed a first glance could tell the whole story, the power of the music the next morning felt different. From all the mornings before, the air outside was the same, the streets just as noisy, the bus just as crowded. But something inside her had shifted. She boarded the bus in her usual uniform, violin case in hand, only now. The stares she felt weren't heavy with judgment. They carried something else. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity. A woman near the front gave her a small smile. An older man nodded as she passed. It was subtle, but she noticed every bit of it. She took her seat and let her mind drift back to the night before. She could still feel the warmth of the stage lights. Still hear the applause echoing in her ears. It wasn't just the sound that stayed with her. It was the way that music had filled the room. For a moment, it had been bigger than her fears, bigger than her uniform. It had been the truth she had wanted people to see for years. Halfway through the ride, the businessman from the bus the night before stepped on. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked straight to her row and sat beside her. For a moment, they sat in silence, the low hum of the engine between them. Then he spoke. His voice quieter than she expected. "I was there last night," he said. She turned to look at him, unsure what to say. "I didn't know it was you until you started playing," he continued. "You were incredible." She nodded once in thanks. Not out of shyness, but because she wasn't sure how else to respond. He hesitated, then added, "I think I've been guilty of judging too quickly." There it was, the unspoken truth she had felt. For so long, she didn't try to soften it for him. "We all do it sometimes," she said, her tone calm. But music doesn't care who's listening. When she got off the bus, the city felt different in small ways. Not because the world had suddenly become kinder, but because she had claimed a piece of it for herself as she walked toward the tall glass buildings she guarded every day. She noticed two of her co-workers near the entrance. They were usually polite but distant. Today, one of them called out, "We saw you online." Someone posted a video of your performance. Her heart skipped. She hadn't realized anyone had recorded it. They both grinned and said they'd shared it with friends. For the first time in a long while, she saw them looking at her as more than just the uniform. The day went on. But her mind kept returning to the thought that the music hadn't stopped with the last note. It was still moving, traveling beyond the walls of that cultural center, and that realization lit something inside her, a quiet urge to keep playing. Not just in hidden parks or behind closed doors, but where people could hear, where it might make them pause, where it might make them think that evening. She walked through the park again. The same bench waited for her at the far end. Under the glow of a street lamp, she opened her violin case, and as she played, a few passers-by slowed down to listen. A young boy tugged at his mother's hand, pointing toward her. The mother smiled and let him stand there for a moment, watching. When she finished, the boy clapped shyly, and she gave him a small nod. It was such a simple thing, a few strangers stopping in a park, but she could feel the connection. That silent bridge music built between people. The next day, her phone buzzed with a message from the old man who had invited her. He told her the organizers wanted her to perform again next year, this time officially on the program. She read the message twice, then set the phone down and looked at her violin case. It wasn't about the stage anymore. It was about the truth she could carry with her, anywhere. She realized she didn't need a spotlight to change how people saw her. She only needed to keep playing. That weekend, she tried something new. She went to the busy plaza downtown, the one filled with street vendors and small cafes. She opened her case on the ground, not for money, but to let people know she was there for the music. At first, a few curious looks, a couple of skeptical glances. Then she began to play, and the space around her shifted. Conversations softened, footsteps slowed. People gathered, not in a rush, but drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. She saw a mix of faces in the small crowd, workers in uniforms like hers, teenagers with headphones hanging around their necks, an elderly couple holding hands. They weren't thinking about what job she had or where she came from. They were only listening, and that, she thought, was the real power of music. Stripped away the labels and left only the human part, when she packed up to leave, one of the women who had been listening stepped forward. "You should do this more often," she said warmly. "The city needs it." She smiled. Maybe the city did need it. But so did she that night, as she took the bus home. She leaned her head against the window and watched the lights blur past. She thought about all the mornings she had ridden in silence, all the times she had been reduced to just a uniform, and how now she was something more in the eyes of those same people. Not because she had changed who she was, but because she had let the music speak first. After the show, a week had passed since the night of the cultural performance. The memory was still fresh in her mind. The warm stage lights, the stillness in the room before her first note, and the applause that had felt like it carried the weight of every unspoken word she'd ever wanted to say. But now life had returned to its familiar rhythm. The early mornings, the uniform, the bus rides, the quiet shifts standing by glass doors, except it wasn't exactly the same. She noticed the changes in the smallest moments. The cashier at the corner tea stall smiled when handing her a cup. A man from the neighboring building nodded in greeting as she passed. Even her coworkers, who used to only talk to her about schedules and duty shifts, now asked about her music. The shift was subtle but constant. People saw her. It's not just the uniform. One afternoon, while she was on break, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from the young guitarists she'd met backstage after the show. "We're playing at the Plaza this weekend. Want to join?" She stared at the message for a moment. Her first instinct was to say no. She wasn't a public musician. She wasn't part of their circle. Then she remembered the Plaza where she'd played alone last week, the way strangers had stopped to listen, the way it had felt like the city itself had paused for her music. She typed back a simple yes and sent it before she could change her mind. That weekend, she arrived at the Plaza just as the afternoon sun was softening into evening light. The guitarist greeted her with a grin, and a small group of other performers waved her over. They weren't dressed in anything fancy: jeans, jackets, sneakers. She was still in her uniform. And this time, she didn't care. When it was her turn to play, she stepped forward. The sounds of the street, chatter, footsteps, the clinking of cups from nearby cafes faded as her bow touched the strings. The music she played that day was lighter than the one from the cultural night. It danced through the air, weaving between people's conversations. Children stopped to watch. A man set down his coffee just to listen. A group of tourists took photos when she finished. The guitarist clapped the loudest, grinning at her like she'd been part of their group for years. That evening, as the performers packed up, one of them said, "You've got something special. Not just skill, but the way people look at you when you play." On the bus ride home that night, she sat by the window. The violin case rested on her lap. Across from her sat a woman she recognized from the morning route, someone who had once looked at her with the same dismissive glance she'd felt so many times before. But now the woman smiled and said, "I saw you at the cultural night. You made me cry," it was said without embarrassment, just honesty. And it made her realize something. The music hadn't just changed the way people saw her. It had reached them in a way that went beyond appearances over the next few days. Small moments like that kept happening. An elderly man in the park asked if she could teach his granddaughter. A shopkeeper near her workplace told her he'd seen her video online. Even strangers on the bus sometimes leaned over to ask if she was the one who played at the cultural night. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was constant, and with every conversation, she felt the invisible wall that had once stood between her and others slowly crumble. One evening, as she walked home from work, she passed the same spot in the park where she had first met the old man with the cane. She paused, looking around, half expecting to see him there again. And then, almost as if on cue, he appeared from the path, walking slowly toward her. He smiled the same way he had that first night. "I knew you'd make them listen," he said simply. She nodded. "Thank you." "For giving me the chance?" He shook his head. "No, you were already ready. You just needed to step into the light. That night, she didn't go straight home. She took the long route. Walking through streets lit by shop signs and the glow of warm windows, she could hear faint music drifting from a cafe. And for a moment, she imagined her own notes mixing with theirs. The thought made her smile, because she realized that her life hadn't been split in two before and after the performance. It was still the same life, the same job, the same uniform, the same bus rides, but now there was something new running alongside it. A thread of music connecting her to people in ways she had never imagined. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning.